Good morning. My name's Rob Ramrath, and I'm a GCA host on GCA Studios, brought to you by the Game Change Agency. And today I'm going to be talking with Prat Moghe, the founder and CEO of Cazena, Big Data as a Service. And we'll be having a conversation about people's response and reaction to change. Good morning, Prat, and thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Rob. Thanks for having me over.
Thank you. Let me take a moment to introduce Pratt. First of all, his bio is on the website, so you can see a lot of detail of his extensive career. But suffice it to say that Pratt's an accomplished and successful serial entrepreneur with over 18 years of service. He worked with IBM upon its acquisition of Netezza. Pratt gives back to the community as well, where he was the president of Thai Boston, whose mission is to foster successful entrepreneurship. And of course, presently he's founder and CEO of Cazena Big Data as a Service. Hopefully some of you have had the opportunity to take a look at my interview with Jay Leader about change in the context of big established organization. I've known Pratt for a few years now, and he came to mind as a perfect complement to Jay, where we could discuss change through the lens of a smaller entrepreneurial organization. And surely there would be rather profound differences. But let me frame this up for a moment. I'm not going to take as much time to frame this as I did with Jay's interview, because I'm hoping you've seen that. You heard me comment about that change has been written about all the way from Buddha, 500 BC. He talked about change, that change is everything, nothing remains without change. And then, of course, we had Who Moved My Cheese, Clay Christensen's seminal book on the innovator's dilemma. So it's been around for a long time. I talked about, of course, major disruptors in industries such as Uber and Lyft and Airbnb. We don't have to go into any detail on that. Of course, Amazon is changing everything. But an aspect of change that I want to really get into is very specifically is ambiguity. I think people struggle a lot with ambiguity. It's one thing when people know about change as going from point A to point B when both are clearly defined, but it's a real struggle when people know that point A, upon which their business is grounded, their skills are grounded, point A starts to actually disintegrate in front of them and they have no idea what point B looks like or where it is. You can see this happening with brick and mortar retail, how everybody is struggling in the context of Amazon, the Goliath. You can look ahead at network TV and cable providers. We all know that they're heading for a wipeout, but nobody knows what point B is going to be. My belief, Pratt, is as a serial entrepreneur, you eat change and ambiguity for lunch, that indeed you are defining point B. So it's a pleasure for you to move away from point A that you don't establish yourself in at all and create a point B. So first, let's learn a little bit about you and some of the changes and disruptions along your career. Could you give us some idea of how you've encountered change and big stories of your past?
Thanks, Rob. So first off, I would say that this is a great topic you picked, the change topic and ambiguity as it relates to change. My personal background is I trained as a technologist, started my career at Bell Labs, and so very much foundationally joined a group of people who are all about disrupting and inventing the next new idea, and really had a great time there and learned a lot of the first principles in terms of you just essentially think out of the box. You have no constraints, and that's how people created Unix and C and C++ and many other disruptions coming out of Bell Labs. And I worked with these researchers, and that's how I started my career. And since I've done several startups, which have started either from ground zero, or they've been startups that have scaled up all the way, being inside really large companies like IBM. And recently, 4 years back, I started a company called Cazena, Big Data as a Service, which is essentially the mission is to take medium and large companies to the cloud for their analytics. And then that's sort of the next big transformation we see coming. And so I've been really excited, blessed, fortunate to be here, witnessing many of these transformative industry cycles, right? And so as being part of the industry, I've sort of experienced both sides of it, being in the shoes of incumbents who are experiencing disruption being done to them, as well as being in a startup that's trying to disrupt the status quo, as well as working with many companies, customers, and enterprises that are themselves part of this change that's going on, because we are partnering with these enterprises, and in many cases we are helping them transform themselves or prevent themselves from being disrupted and then staying leaders. So that's been my journey, and I'm excited to join you here on this sort of a stimulating thread. So thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pratt. That's an amazing setup to a career of entrepreneurship, starting out at Bell Labs. Wow. I'm gonna read something here. I found a quote from an Upwire podcast by Dr. Robert Cooper, and I thought it was rather profound. It's a little bit long, but I'm going to read it verbatim. So if you would just stick with me for a minute. So here's the quote. Left to its own devices, the brain is hardwired to steadily and stubbornly die instead of grow. How? In part by firing old neural habits or circuits that are less in touch with new opportunities than last hour or yesterday or before. And the past habits' defensiveness of the brain's view puts it at natural odds with testing new approaches for better, faster, or higher results. Why? Mostly because the brain is inherently wired to try to keep everything the same as in the past, whether that's last hour, last week, last year, or a decade or more ago. Exceptional leaders and teams repeatedly choose to grow faster than the world is changing. Wow, if this is true, it could explain a lot about change resistance. What do you think about this?
Yeah, blame it on our brain, right?
There you go.
So that's a really interesting observation. One sort of seminal study, done, if you've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Professor Kahneman, which is sort of really a seminal book that has impacted many industries, particularly marketing and messaging and the way you deal with change. His observation is that brain essentially has two systems, system 1 and system 2. System 1 is sort of like the frontal system, where it's all about reacting fast and it's all about instinct. And system 2 is the slow and deliberate process that's going on in the brain, and it's all about building context, patterns over time. And system 2 does not change very often. System 1, on the other hand, is all about real-time processing of immediate things, like tiger shows up, what do I do, right? But the system 2 is all about the context, like I'm in a jungle versus I'm in the city versus I'm now interviewing. And then so there is a context setup. And I think one of the challenges we have in general is that the system 2 doesn't change very often. And there's a good reason for it, because you don't want it to change very often. The kind of work it would constantly have to do to adapt would pretty much lead to thrashing. So I think the whole premise here is to deal with change, with more frequent change. I think the key is to figure out if our system 2 can be adapted to be able to deal with more frequent changes, rather than sort of have this system that's all static, wired, rarely changes. Because I think the brain has a tendency to reduce the entropy and do minimum work, right? Like it's essentially, if you think about it, it's almost like it's reduce the power consumed by only firing a certain number of circuits. And if that can work, then it's great. Every time you see a system 1 input that is completely different and jarring, that goes into the system 2 database, and over time it starts to change the rules. And so I think, coming back to your observation, I think it's all about by nature, I think everyone's brain is tuned to doing minimum work to be most efficient. What you have to do is figure out how to, if you can, train it to wake up to the reality that the context itself is changing more frequently than it used to.